The rain had been falling for hours, turning the quiet suburban streets into empty, silent paths. Under the dim glow of old streetlights, Ethan Brooks, a 23-year-old young man, pulled the hood of his jacket over his head and looked around carefully. He had never imagined his life would lead him to this moment. Once a hopeful college student with dreams of building a better future, he had lost everything after a series of bad decisions and financial struggles. With no family to support him and nowhere left to turn, desperation had slowly replaced hope. Tonight, Ethan had convinced himself that breaking into a house was the only way to survive. At the end of the street stood an old two-story home surrounded by a wooden fence and overgrown bushes. The lights were off and the place looked abandoned. Ethan watched it from across the road for several minutes before quietly climbing over the fence. "This looks empty," he whispered to himself. He carefully unlocked a small kitchen window and slipped inside. Every step echoed through the silent house. The air smelled of old books, polished wood, and memories that had not been disturbed in years. His heartbeat grew louder as he searched through drawers and cabinets. He wasn't looking for expensive jewelry or luxury items. He only wanted enough money to eat for the next few days. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed framed photographs hanging on the walls. Most of them showed a younger man smiling beside a beautiful woman. In newer pictures, however, only the man remained. Dust covered the empty spaces where other photographs had once been displayed. Something about the house felt different. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt lonely. Ethan slowly reached for the doorknob of the bedroom at the end of the hallway. He hesitated before pushing the door open. Inside, sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, was Richard Carter, a 50-year-old man. Their eyes met instantly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. I'm sorry," Ethan stammered as he instinctively stepped backward. Richard didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply looked at the frightened young man standing in his bedroom. "I was wondering when someone would finally come through that window," Richard said calmly. Ethan blinked in confusion. "You knew?" Richard gave a tired smile. "This neighborhood isn't what it used to be." Ethan expected anger. He expected threats. Maybe even a phone call to the police. Instead, Richard slowly stood up and pointed toward a chair near the window. "Sit down." Ethan remained frozen. "I'm not going to hurt you," Richard continued. "And if I wanted you arrested, I would have called the police the moment I heard someone inside." Still uncertain, Ethan slowly sat down. The silence between them felt heavy. Richard walked toward the kitchen and returned a few moments later carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee. "You look cold," he said, placing one mug in front of Ethan. "No one has ever offered me coffee while I was breaking into their house," Ethan admitted with an awkward laugh. Richard smiled softly. "There's a first time for everything." The tension slowly faded. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like someone was looking at him as a person instead of a criminal. Richard noticed the bruises on Ethan's hands and the exhaustion in his eyes. "When was the last time you ate?" Ethan looked away. "I don't remember." Without saying another word, Richard returned to the kitchen again. A few minutes later, he placed a warm plate of food on the table. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. "You should eat." "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," Richard replied gently. "But hunger doesn't care about what someone deserves." Those words struck Ethan harder than any insult ever could. He quietly picked up the fork. Every bite reminded him how long it had been since someone had cared whether he lived or starved. After dinner, Richard leaned back in his chair. "So," he asked, "what brought a 23-year-old into my house tonight?" Ethan hesitated. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he told the truth. He spoke about losing his apartment. About unpaid bills. About friends who disappeared when life became difficult. About spending nights sleeping wherever he could. Richard listened without interrupting once. When Ethan finished speaking, the room became quiet again. "I know what loneliness feels like," Richard finally said. Ethan looked up. Richard's eyes wandered toward one of the old photographs on the wall. "I was married once." He paused. "My wife left many years ago." "You have children?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No." The answer carried more sadness than the single word could express. "This house used to be full of laughter," Richard continued. "Now." He looked around the empty room. "It's just me." For the first time that night, Ethan saw beyond the large house. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't comfort. It was loneliness hidden behind expensive furniture and quiet rooms. 2 strangers. One carrying poverty. The other carrying silence. Both searching for something they couldn't buy. Hours passed as they continued talking. They laughed over old memories. Shared stories about mistakes. spoke about dreams they had almost forgotten. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The first light of dawn began shining through the windows. Ethan slowly stood up. I should leave. Richard looked at him for a moment. Do you have anywhere to go? Ethan lowered his eyes. No. Richard took a deep breath before answering. Then stay for breakfast. Ethan smiled faintly. It was a small invitation. But after months of feeling invisible, it meant everything. Neither of them realized that the strange encounter born from a desperate mistake would become the beginning of an unexpected friendship. What started as the story of a young thief entering the wrong house had quietly become the story of two lonely souls finding someone who truly listened. Sometimes, life changes not because everything goes according to plan, but because two broken paths unexpectedly cross on the same rainy night. Morning sunlight poured through the old kitchen windows as Ethan Brooks, 23 years old, quietly sat at the dining table. The warmth of fresh coffee and homemade breakfast felt unfamiliar after weeks of living on the streets. Across from him sat Richard Carter, a 50-year-old man whose calm smile hid years of loneliness. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence was comfortable instead of awkward, as though both men understood that some emotions were too heavy for immediate conversation. Richard finally broke the silence. You don't have to rush away. Ethan looked toward the front door. I've spent most of my life leaving before people asked me to. Richard nodded slowly. I know that feeling. Those simple words caught Ethan's attention. For the first time, he realized Richard wasn't just being kind out of sympathy. There was something familiar in his eyes, something that reflected the same emptiness Ethan had been carrying for years. After breakfast, Richard offered Ethan a tour of the house. The home was larger than Ethan had expected, but every room felt strangely quiet. The furniture was well cared for, the shelves were neatly organized, and the floors shined as though someone spent hours keeping everything perfect. Yet despite its beauty, the house felt incomplete. It lacked laughter. It lacked life. As they walked down the hallway, Ethan noticed dozens of framed photographs hanging on the walls. Most showed Richard years earlier with a smiling woman. Some pictures were taken during vacations. Others showed birthdays, family dinners, and holiday celebrations. Ethan stopped in front of one photograph. You both looked happy. Richard smiled softly. We were. His smile slowly faded. For a long time. They continued walking until they reached a small room filled with books. A single rocking chair stood beside the window. Richard gently ran his hand across its wooden armrest. My wife loved sitting here. Ethan remained quiet. I still haven't moved the chair. Why? Richard looked outside. Because sometimes letting go feels like losing someone all over again. The room became silent. Ethan had never considered how painful memories could become. For him, memories were things people escaped from. For Richard, they were the only pieces of happiness he had left. After a long pause, Richard finally began telling his story. I married when I was young. My wife and I believed we would spend our entire lives together. We dreamed about having children. We planned vacations. We imagined growing old in this very house. He smiled briefly. But life doesn't always follow the plans we make. Ethan listened carefully. There were years when I cared more about work than family. I thought earning more money would make us happy. I kept saying I was doing it for us. But I was never really there. Richard lowered his eyes. One day she told me she couldn't live with someone who was always emotionally absent. So she left. Ethan remained silent. I thought she'd come back. Richard let out a quiet laugh filled with sadness. She never did. The confession carried no anger. Only regret. Ethan slowly sat down across from him. I'm sorry. Richard shook his head. Don't be. I made my choices. And I live with them every day. Those words stayed in Ethan's mind. For years he had blamed everyone else for his problems. His friends. His circumstances. His bad luck. Listening to Richard made him realize that everyone carried regrets. Some simply learned how to hide them better. Later that afternoon, Ethan helped Richard clean the backyard. The overgrown garden slowly began coming back to life. As they worked together, their conversations became easier. They laughed over simple mistakes. Shared stories from childhood. Talked about favorite movies. For the first time in months, Ethan smiled without pretending. Richard noticed. You have a good smile. Ethan chuckled. I forgot I still had one. Richard laughed quietly. You shouldn't. As the sun began setting, they sat on the wooden porch overlooking the peaceful neighborhood. The evening breeze carried the scent of flowers growing near the fence. Richard spoke again. You know, I've lived in this house alone for nearly 10 years. I got used to eating dinner in silence. I stopped cooking real meals. I stopped celebrating birthdays. I even stopped decorating for Christmas. Ethan looked toward him. Didn't anyone visit? Richard shook his head. Some neighbors. Old co-workers once in a while. But eventually everyone becomes busy living their own lives. And you realize loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. It comes from having no one who truly understands you. Those words struck Ethan deeply. He had spent years surrounded by people who disappeared the moment life became difficult. Richard had spent years surrounded by memories that never disappeared. Different lives. The same loneliness. As darkness covered the neighborhood, Ethan quietly spoke. When I was younger, I thought having money would solve everything. Richard smiled. And now? Ethan looked toward the stars. Now I think having someone who waits for you to come home might be worth even more. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead he simply nodded. Sometimes understanding required no words. Later that night, Ethan prepared dinner while Richard set the table. It wasn't a fancy meal. Just simple food shared between two people who no longer felt completely alone. During dinner they laughed over burnt toast and old family recipes. The empty dining room that had remained silent for years slowly filled with conversation once again. Richard looked around the room with quiet gratitude. It feels different tonight. Ethan smiled. It does. For the first time in many years, Richard didn't feel like he was eating alone. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was an unwanted stranger. Neither of them could erase the mistakes of the past. Neither could change the years they had already lost. But they had discovered something unexpected. Healing didn't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it started with a shared meal, an honest conversation, and the simple comfort of knowing someone was willing to listen. In that quiet old house, two lonely hearts began finding hope again, not because life had suddenly become perfect, but because neither of them had to face tomorrow completely alone. The morning after the unexpected meeting felt different for both men. The rain had disappeared, leaving the garden outside washed clean by the night's storm. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the old house, filling the quiet rooms with a gentle warmth. Ethan Brooks, 23 years old, sat at the wooden dining table with a mug of coffee in his hands. Across from him, Richard Carter, a 50-year-old man, calmly prepared breakfast as though having another person in the house was the most natural thing in the world. For Ethan it felt unreal. Only a few hours earlier, he had entered the house intending to steal. Instead of being arrested, he had been welcomed with kindness. He still couldn't understand why Richard had trusted him so easily. Richard placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of Ethan. "You should eat while it's hot," he said with a small smile. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." The words felt too small for the gratitude he carried inside. As they ate, the silence between them was peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Ethan noticed that Richard often glanced toward the hallway, as though expecting someone to walk through it. When breakfast was finished, Richard stood up. "Would you like to see the house?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "If you're sure." Richard smiled. "I wouldn't have offered if I wasn't." They slowly walked through the old home. Every room was neat and carefully maintained. The furniture had been polished, the books were arranged perfectly, and not a single object seemed out of place. Yet something felt missing. The house was beautiful, but it wasn't alive. As they entered the living room, Ethan noticed dozens of framed photographs covering one wall. Most showed a younger Richard standing beside a smiling woman with bright eyes and a joyful expression. "You were married," Ethan said softly. Richard nodded. "Yes." "You both looked happy." A gentle smile crossed Richard's face. "We truly were." His voice carried warmth, but his eyes carried sadness. They continued into a small reading room overlooking the backyard. A rocking chair sat beside the window, untouched by time. "My wife loved this chair," Richard said quietly. "You never moved it?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No. Sometimes memories are all a person has left." Ethan looked around the room. Everything had been preserved exactly as it must have been years ago. The books. The blanket folded over the chair. Even a dried flower rested inside an old glass vase. It was as if time had stopped the day Richard became alone. After sitting down, Richard took a deep breath. "I haven't talked about this with anyone in a long time." "You don't have to," Ethan replied gently. "I know. But maybe it's time." Richard looked out the window before continuing. "I married when I was 27. My wife and I dreamed about growing old together. We wanted children. We wanted a noisy home filled with laughter. For a while, everything seemed perfect." He smiled at the memories. We traveled. We celebrated birthdays. We spent evenings cooking together. I believed nothing could ever separate us. His smile slowly disappeared. But I became obsessed with work. I kept telling myself I was building a better future. I worked longer hours. I missed anniversaries. I missed holidays. I stopped listening. Ethan remained completely silent. Richard continued. She never asked for expensive gifts. She never cared about money. She only wanted my time. I didn't understand that until it was too late. One evening she packed her belongings. Richard's voice became quieter. She told me she felt invisible. I begged her to stay. But people can only wait so long before they stop believing things will change. She left. The room became silent. Ethan could hear nothing except the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Did you ever see her again? He asked carefully. Richard nodded. Once. It was years later. She looked happy. I realized she had found the peace I couldn't give her. There was no bitterness in his voice. Only regret. I never remarried. I never wanted anyone else. Ethan lowered his eyes. I know what it feels like to lose everything. Richard looked toward him. What happened? For several moments Ethan said nothing. Finally he answered. My parents died when I was young. I moved between relatives. Nobody really wanted me. When I became an adult, I believed I could handle life alone. I found work. I rented a small apartment. But after losing my job, everything fell apart. I couldn't pay rent. I sold almost everything I owned. My friends slowly disappeared. And eventually, he paused. I ended up trying to steal from your house. Richard didn't judge him. Instead, he simply nodded with understanding. Loneliness changes people. Ethan looked surprised. You don't think I'm a bad person? Richard smiled gently. I think you made a desperate decision. That isn't the same thing. Those words struck Ethan deeply. Nobody had spoken to him with such compassion in years. Later that afternoon, the two men worked together in the neglected garden. They trimmed bushes, watered flowers, and cleared away fallen branches. As they worked side by side, conversation came more naturally. Richard shared funny stories about his younger years. Ethan laughed harder than he had in months. For a brief moment, the heavy weight both men carried seemed lighter. When evening arrived, they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of orange and gold. It's beautiful, Ethan whispered. Richard nodded. I used to watch sunsets alone. He smiled toward Ethan. They seem different when someone is sitting beside you. Ethan smiled back. I think everything does. That night they prepared dinner together, talking about music, books, favorite meals, and dreams they had once abandoned. The house that had echoed with silence for nearly a decade slowly filled with conversation again. Richard realized he had laughed more in one day than he had during the previous year. Ethan realized he had finally found a place where he wasn't judged by his mistakes. Neither man knew what the future would bring. But one thing had become clear. Sometimes the deepest loneliness isn't cured by time. It begins to heal when someone listens without judging, understands without asking for explanations, and offers kindness without expecting anything in return. In that quiet old house, two lonely hearts discovered that even after years of loss, hope could still return through the simple gift of genuine human connection. The old house no longer felt unfamiliar to Ethan Brooks, 23 years old. 3 days had passed since the night he had climbed through the kitchen window, expecting to steal enough money to survive. Instead, he had found something he never expected: kindness. Every morning, he helped Richard Carter, a 50-year-old man, prepare breakfast. Every afternoon, they worked around the house together. Every evening, they sat on the front porch, talking about life while watching the sunset disappear beyond the trees. Still, Ethan carried one heavy burden inside him: guilt. No matter how kind Richard was, Ethan could not forget the reason he had entered the house. One afternoon, while cleaning the garage, Ethan found an old toolbox filled with valuable antique watches and silver coins. They were worth far more than anything he had expected to find. For a brief second, temptation returned. He stared at the collection in silence. With those valuables he could leave town. He could start over somewhere else. No one would ever know. But then he remembered Richard serving him breakfast. He remembered the warm bed he had been given. He remembered the conversations that had slowly healed the loneliness inside him. Ethan quietly closed the toolbox without touching anything. When he walked back into the house, Richard was reading a book in the living room. You found the old collection? Richard asked with a smile. Ethan looked surprised. You knew it was there? Richard nodded. I forgot to lock the cabinet. Ethan hesitated before speaking. I thought about taking it. Richard calmly closed his book. And? I couldn't. Richard looked into Ethan's eyes. I know. You know. Richard smiled gently. If you wanted to steal from me, you would have disappeared already. The words left Ethan speechless. I trusted you. No one had ever trusted Ethan after learning about his mistakes. He lowered his head. I don't deserve your trust. Richard stood up and walked toward him. Trust isn't something people earn only after becoming perfect. Sometimes trust is the reason people choose to become better. Those words stayed with Ethan for the rest of the day. That evening, while preparing dinner together, Richard accidentally dropped a heavy pot onto the kitchen floor. Ethan immediately rushed over. Are you all right? Richard laughed softly. I'm getting older. Ethan helped him pick everything up. You don't have to do everything yourself anymore. Richard looked at him thoughtfully. I've been doing everything alone for so many years. Maybe it's time I stopped. After dinner, they sat outside beneath a sky filled with stars. Richard spoke quietly. Can I ask you something? Of course. If I had called the police that first night, what do you think would have happened? Ethan looked toward the empty street. I probably would have gone to jail. And after that? I honestly don't know. Richard nodded. That's why I didn't call. Ethan turned toward him. You weren't afraid? Richard smiled. I was. But fear isn't always the best guide. I looked at you and saw someone who seemed more lost than dangerous. Ethan felt tears forming in his eyes. No one has ever seen me that way. Richard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Everyone deserves to be seen as more than their worst mistake. The following morning, Ethan woke up early and quietly cleaned the entire house before Richard came downstairs. When Richard entered the kitchen, he looked around in surprise. You did all this? Ethan smiled. I wanted to help. Richard nodded proudly. I appreciate it. Over the next several days, Ethan repaired broken shelves, painted old fences, and planted flowers in the front garden. Neighbors walking past the house noticed the changes. One afternoon, an elderly woman from across the street stopped outside the fence. Richard, she called with a smile, your grandson is a hard-working young man. Richard laughed. He's not my grandson. The woman smiled warmly. Well, whoever he is, it's nice seeing someone keeping you company. After she left, Ethan looked embarrassed. I hope she doesn't think I'm pretending to be family. Richard looked toward the colorful flowers growing beside the walkway. Family isn't always about blood. It's about who stays. Those simple words meant more to Ethan than Richard realized. One rainy evening, the electricity suddenly went out. The house became dark except for the light of a single candle Richard placed on the dining table. As thunder echoed outside, they shared stories from their childhoods. Richard spoke about learning to ride a bicycle with his father. Ethan shared memories of building paper airplanes with his mother before she passed away. For hours they laughed, remembered, and listened. The darkness outside no longer felt frightening. The house felt warmer than ever. Later that night, Ethan stood by the living room window watching the rain. I've been thinking, he said quietly. About what? I can't stay here forever. Richard remained silent. I don't want people thinking I'm taking advantage of your kindness. Richard slowly walked over. I wasn't offering charity. I was offering you a chance. A chance to rebuild your life. Ethan looked at him. And what if I fail again? Richard smiled kindly. Then we'll figure out the next step. Together. That single word carried more comfort than Ethan had felt in years. Together. Not alone. For the first time since losing everything, Ethan believed his future wasn't already decided by his past. Richard also realized something important. The quiet house that had once echoed with loneliness now carried the sounds of conversation, laughter, and hope. The empty chair at the dinner table was no longer empty. The long evenings no longer felt endless. Trust had transformed two strangers into companions who genuinely cared about one another. Neither of them knew what challenges the future might bring. Life had a way of testing even the strongest friendships. But they also understood something far more important. Fear builds walls between people. Trust builds bridges. And sometimes, one person's decision to trust instead of judge can completely change another person's life. For Ethan Brooks, Richard Carter's trust became the first real step toward becoming the man he had always wanted to be. For Richard Carter, opening his door to a frightened young stranger became the beginning of a friendship that reminded him life could still surprise him in the most unexpected ways. Their story had started with fear. Now it was being built on trust. Several weeks had passed since Ethan Brooks, a 23-year-old young man, had unexpectedly entered Richard Carter's life. What had begun as a desperate mistake slowly became a routine neither of them wanted to lose. The old house, once filled with silence, now echoed with conversation, laughter, and the comforting sounds of two people sharing everyday life. Each morning began the same way. Richard woke early to make coffee while Ethan prepared breakfast. They would sit together by the kitchen window, talking about everything from books and music to childhood memories and future dreams. These simple moments became the highlight of their days. For Richard, the quiet loneliness that had followed him for years was slowly fading. For Ethan, the house had become the first place that truly felt like home. One Saturday morning, Richard suggested they visit the local farmer's market. "It has been years since I walked around there," he admitted. Ethan smiled. "Then today sounds like the perfect day to go." As they wandered through the market, neighbors greeted Richard with surprised smiles. Many had not seen him outside enjoying himself in a long time. Some quietly noticed the young man walking beside him and assumed Ethan was a relative or close family friend. Richard didn't bother correcting them. Instead, he simply smiled. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking alone. They bought fresh vegetables, homemade bread, and a small bouquet of white flowers. When Ethan asked who the flowers were for, Richard answered softly, "My dining table has looked empty for too long." Back home, Ethan placed the flowers in a glass vase. The dining room instantly felt brighter. "It's amazing how something so small changes the whole room," Ethan said. Richard looked at the flowers before smiling at Ethan. "Sometimes people do the same thing." The words stayed with Ethan for the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, they worked together in the backyard. The once neglected garden had begun to bloom again. Colorful flowers lined the pathways, fresh grass covered the ground, and birds had returned to the trees. Richard watched Ethan planting new flowers. "You've changed this place." Ethan shook his head. "We changed it." Richard nodded. "You're right." As the weeks passed, their friendship grew stronger. They cooked meals together, watched old movies on rainy evenings, played chess after dinner. Sometimes Richard won. Sometimes Ethan did. Other times they laughed so much that neither of them cared who had won. One evening, while organizing old boxes in the attic, Ethan found several dusty photo albums. He carefully opened one. Inside were photographs of Richard and his late wife during happier times. Vacations by the beach, holiday celebrations, family gatherings. Richard slowly walked over. "I haven't looked at those in years." "You don't have to if it hurts," Ethan said gently. Richard looked through the photographs one by one. "It still hurts." He paused. "But now the memories make me smile more than they make me cry." Ethan closed the album carefully. "I'm glad." Richard looked at him thoughtfully. "I think she would have wanted that." That night, after dinner, they sat on the front porch watching fireflies dance across the garden. The evening air was cool and peaceful. Richard finally spoke. "You know something?" "What?" "I spent years believing my happiest days were behind me." Ethan remained quiet. "I thought loneliness was simply something I had to accept." He looked toward the glowing porch light. "But life has a strange way of surprising us." Ethan smiled softly. "It really does." Over time, Ethan found a steady job at a nearby repair shop. The work wasn't glamorous, but he enjoyed it. Each evening he returned home tired but proud. Richard always waited with dinner ready. "How was work today?" he would ask. Ethan always had a new story to tell. Slowly, confidence returned to Ethan's life. He no longer saw himself as the frightened young man who had climbed through a stranger's window. He saw someone building an honest future. Richard noticed the change as well. "You stand taller now," he said one evening. Ethan laughed. "Maybe because I finally have something worth standing for." As autumn arrived, colorful leaves covered the yard. Together they spent weekends cleaning the garden and decorating the house. The empty rooms no longer felt cold. Music often played while they cooked. Fresh flowers sat on the dining table every week. The old house finally felt alive again. One evening there was a knock at the front door. It was the elderly neighbor from across the street carrying a homemade pie. "I wanted to thank both of you," she said warmly. "This neighborhood hasn't heard laughter coming from this house in years." Richard smiled with genuine gratitude. After she left, he quietly said, "I never realized how much silence had surrounded me." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes we don't notice loneliness until it starts disappearing." Richard smiled. "I think you're right." As winter approached, they decorated the house with simple lights for the holidays. It was the first time Richard had celebrated in many years. While placing ornaments on the tree, he paused. "I almost didn't decorate this year." "What changed your mind?" Ethan asked. Richard looked around the room. I finally had someone to celebrate with. The words filled Ethan with emotion. For years he had searched for acceptance. Now he had found it in the most unexpected place. On Christmas Eve they shared dinner, exchanged small gifts and spent hours talking by the fireplace. Richard gave Ethan a leather notebook. For your future plans, he explained. Ethan handed Richard a framed photograph they had taken together while working in the garden. I thought the house deserved one new memory. Richard looked at the picture for a long time. His eyes became misty. This may be my favorite photograph. The old house no longer represented loss alone. It represented new beginnings. Neither Richard nor Ethan tried to replace the people or chapters they had lost. Instead, they chose to honor the past while embracing the present. Their bond was built on kindness, trust, and the decision to care for one another through ordinary days as well as difficult ones. The loneliness that had once defined both of their lives slowly gave way to companionship, hope, and quiet happiness. Sometimes love does not arrive with grand speeches or dramatic moments. Sometimes it grows through shared meals, honest conversations, small acts of kindness, and the simple promise that no one has to face tomorrow alone. In the home that had once been filled with silence, Richard Carter and Ethan Brooks discovered that even after years of loneliness, the heart could still find its way back to happiness. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and the old house looked brighter than it had in years. Fresh flowers bloomed in the garden, birds built nests in the trees, and sunlight poured through windows that had once overlooked a lonely, silent home. For Richard Carter, now 50 years old, life no longer felt empty. For Ethan Brooks, 23 years old, every new day felt like another chance to build the future he had almost lost. Months had passed since the unexpected night that brought them together. What began with fear had grown into trust, and trust had become a deep friendship built on honesty, respect, and unwavering support. Their daily routine had become simple but meaningful. Every morning they shared breakfast before Ethan left for work at the repair shop. Richard spent his mornings reading, tending the garden, or working on small projects around the house. Every evening Ethan returned home, and they cooked dinner together while talking about everything that had happened during the day. It wasn't an exciting life by most people's standards. But to both of them it was peaceful. One evening after dinner, they sat on the front porch watching the sunset. The neighborhood was quiet. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the yard. Richard looked toward Ethan and smiled. You know, he said, this porch used to remind me how alone I was. Ethan looked around. And now? Richard chuckled softly. Now it reminds me how much life can change. Ethan smiled. I never thought I'd call this place home. Richard nodded. Neither did I. A few days later Ethan received wonderful news. His manager offered him a full-time position along with a promotion. His hard work, honesty, and dedication had earned the respect of everyone at the repair shop. That evening he rushed home with a wide smile. I got promoted. Richard stood up immediately. I knew you could do it. Without thinking, Ethan hugged him. Richard laughed warmly and returned the embrace. I'm proud of you, he said. Those 4 words meant more to Ethan than the promotion itself. No one had told him they were proud of him in many years. To celebrate, they prepared Ethan's favorite dinner and shared a homemade dessert Richard had learned to bake years earlier. As they laughed together, Ethan looked around the dining room. This house feels completely different now. Richard smiled. It finally sounds like a home again. Over the following weeks, Ethan continued saving money. One evening he sat quietly at the kitchen table studying apartment listings. Richard noticed. Looking for your own place? Ethan hesitated. I thought maybe it was time. Richard remained silent for a moment. If that's what you truly want, I'll support you. Ethan looked up. But the truth is. He closed the notebook. I don't want to leave. Richard looked surprised. You don't? Ethan shook his head. This isn't just your house anymore. It feels like my home too. Richard's eyes filled with emotion. I was hoping you'd say that. Ethan smiled. I've spent my whole life searching for a place where I belonged. I think I finally found it. Richard quietly nodded. And I've spent years believing I'd always be alone. I was wrong. The following weekend they decided to renovate one of the empty rooms upstairs. Together they painted the walls, replaced old furniture, and turned it into a bright guest room. This house deserves new memories, Ethan said. Richard smiled. It certainly does. As spring continued, neighbors noticed how much happier Richard had become. He attended community events again. He smiled more often. He even began hosting small weekend barbecues for neighbors and old friends. Everyone commented on the change. One neighbor quietly told Ethan. "I haven't seen Richard this happy in over 10 years. Ethan simply smiled. "He deserves it." One afternoon Richard found an old wooden box hidden in the attic. Inside were handwritten letters, photographs, and family keepsakes. He carefully sorted through them before handing one small journal to Ethan. "I want you to have this." Ethan looked surprised. "I can't accept something so personal." Richard smiled gently. "I want someone I trust to keep it safe." Ethan accepted the journal with great care. "I'll treasure it." "I know you will." That evening they sat beneath the stars in the backyard. The garden around them was alive with colorful flowers they had planted together months earlier. Richard looked toward the sky. "Life gave both of us a second chance." Ethan nodded. "It did. And second chances shouldn't be wasted." Ethan smiled. "They won't be." Richard extended his hand. "No matter what happens in the future. No matter how difficult life becomes. I hope we'll always look out for each other." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "You have my word. It isn't just a promise for today. It's a promise for as long as we're able." Richard smiled warmly. "Then we'll face whatever comes together." From that day forward, their promise guided every decision they made. They celebrated each success together. They supported one another through difficult moments. They reminded each other that family is not always defined by blood, but by loyalty, kindness, and the people who choose to stand beside us when life becomes difficult. Years earlier, one lonely man had opened his door instead of calling the police. One desperate young man had chosen honesty instead of theft. Those two choices changed both of their lives forever. The old house that once echoed with silence became a place filled with laughter, shared meals, meaningful conversations, and lasting memories. Neither Richard nor Ethan could erase the pain of their pasts. But they no longer allowed those painful memories to define their future. Instead, they built a life based on trust, compassion, and hope. Sometimes the greatest promises are not spoken during extraordinary moments. They are made quietly between two people who have learned the value of loyalty and the importance of never facing life alone. And so, beneath the same roof where their unlikely journey had begun, Richard Carter and Ethan Brooks looked toward the future with grateful hearts, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would always have someone to lean on, and that simple promise was enough to make any house feel like home forever.